We are now ready for LB 289. Senator Epke, you're right there.
I'm here.
Go.
Thank you, Senator Seiler and fellow members of the Judiciary Committee. For the record, my name is Laura Epke. That's L-A-U-R-A-E-B-K-E. I represent Nebraska's 32nd Legislative District, made up of Saline, Jefferson, Thayer, Fillmore counties, and the southwest portion of Lancaster County. Today I'm opening on LB 289. This is a bill dealing with certain firearms laws in the state. This is not a bill that attempts to increase the number of firearms. This is not one that really is intended to get to the heart of whether or not firearms are a good or a bad thing. But what we're trying to do is be sure that that our firearms laws are somewhat consistent. There are a number of local ordinances dealing with firearms issues around the state, and they vary greatly from place to place. By making these prohibitive laws more uniform across the state, we protect the rights of individual Nebraskans, and we also help keep law-abiding citizens from unknowingly becoming non-law-abiding citizens. These local ordinances, which I think, did you just hand those out? Okay. These local ordinances govern the ownership, possession, transportation, carrying, registration, transfer, and storage of firearms and firearms ammunition. In addition, certain cities and villages continue to have on the books enactments governing the concealed carry of handguns, although those enactments have been subsumed by the enactment of the State Concealed Handgun Permit Act of 2006. So there's also an issue here of some municipalities being out of compliance with current state law. In the handout you've been provided, you can view some of the examples of the various local ordinances across the state. The citizens of the state of Nebraska need and deserve consistent firearms regulation across the state, consistently enforced in all jurisdictions. A family leaving their central Nebraska community in the fall, for instance, to travel to an event in Lincoln or Omaha should not have to wonder whether a hunting firearm that is transported in their vehicle is in violation of the law in their community of destination or those that they travel through. And when you have a patchwork of laws, you always run the risk of running afoul of some of these laws. An individual relocating to a new community should not have to wonder whether the ownership of a handgun requires registration with law enforcement in the new community. Many of us have had a number of family and friends. I've had some who have moved from a rural area of Nebraska where there were virtually, there was nothing except the state law on the books. They moved to Omaha, they're there for a couple of months, and then realize, oh my goodness, I've been out of compliance for the last 2 months. LB 289 would place consistent statewide uniformity with local firearm enactments while allowing local communities to continue to enact and enforce prohibitions on firearms discharge. I think it's important to note what our state constitution says about firearms. If you go to Article 1, Section 1, in our Statement of Rights, we have a number of things. All persons are by nature free and independent, have certain inherent and inalienable rights. Among these are life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness, and, here's the key part, and the right to keep and bear arms for security or defense of self, family, home, and others, and for lawful common defense, hunting, recreational use, and all other lawful purposes, and such rights shall not be denied or infringed by the state or any subdivision thereof. So it's important to keep in mind our state constitution. I think it's right that local firearms ordinances cannot be stricter than our state laws. This is really about setting legislation and regulation at the appropriate level. This is a constitutional right, and as such, the localities ought to be bound to that. If we want to redefine the Constitution, then let's have that discussion. But as long as we have something in the Constitution, I'm not sure that we ought to allow cities to decide what their means of regulation will be if it's more strict than what the state has legislated. This is really about Setting these at the appropriate level. This is, I think, a reasonable bill. It's a common sense modification that protects citizens' rights. It removes the possibility of individuals being wrongly convicted of a crime which in other parts of the state would be perfectly legal. LB 289 places consistent statewide uniformity with local firearm enactments while allowing local communities to continue to enact and enforce prohibitions on firearms discharge. I hope you'll move LB 289. It is, of course, not a prioritized bill, so the timing is not critical here. I would thank you for your time, and I would be happy to try to address any of your questions. There will be a number of testifiers behind me, I suspect.
Senator Murphy.
Thank you, Senator. Senator Epke, I just know from transporting my own firearm from one state to another for when I backcountry camp, how does this, and I know that there's a federal law that provides for interstate transport of firearms. Do you know how this law would interact
With the federal law?
with the federal law at all? And if there's somebody behind me
I
that can
don't.
answer
I
that.
suspect that Mr. Clark, who knows much more about the federal law, will be able to tell you more.
Okay.
Let me
No
just,
problem.
Let me just say, though, that you raise a very important point, that somebody could unintentionally, be carrying a weapon in their car, unloaded, safely transported. It's perfectly legal for them to do that any place else. They could be pulled over in Lincoln or Omaha, especially Omaha, and technically be out of compliance. If you look, there are a number of communities in the state that have some sort of a regulation. I think Sydney, was it, that has a remarkably strict one. So I think it's important that we try to universalize this. These are people that are for the most part, well, for the whole part, trying to be legal and law-abiding.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Any further questions? Thank you. You're going to stick around for folks.
I suppose so, yeah.
Okay. Next, testimony in support.
I think she's going.
Chairman Seiler, members of the Judiciary Committee, my name is Dick Clark, D-I-C-K, C-L-A-R-K. I'm a member of the NFOA Board of Directors and one of the NFOA's registered lobbyists. Thank you for this opportunity to speak in support of LB 289. Senator Epke's bill would preempt most local ordinances pertaining to carrying, registration, transfer, and storage of firearms, ammunition, and related accessories. The bill would preserve local authority to regulate the discharge of firearms, to provide for appropriate zoning designations, and to enact and enforce policies relating to the use of firearms by those local law enforcement agencies. Finally, LB 289 provides a legal cause of action to facilitate the judicial challenge of the preempted ordinances. The United States and Nebraska constitutions, as you've already heard, both set out a legal right to keep and bear arms, and after centuries of almost no notable cases on the topic, the Supreme Court spoke in the Heller and McDonald cases, affirming the individual right to keep and bear arms and affirming that it's one that's incorporated against the states under the 14th Amendment. Here in Nebraska, exercise of this right is subject not only to federal and state laws, but also a patchwork of local ordinances, especially in the easterly part of the state, although, as you've heard, not exclusively in this end of the state. When the concealed handgun permit statute was enacted, local gun ordinances were preempted by the state, but only for permit holders. In Lincoln and Omaha, there are ordinances on the books today that variously require registration of certain firearms or reporting of some firearms transactions. Lincoln's weapons ordinance adds to the federal and state definition of a prohibited person, meaning that a person may legally own a firearm in another part of the state, but could be subject to prosecution and have the firearm confiscated if he moved to Lincoln. Again, these additional rules are partially preempted by state law already. This has created confusion, as a plain reading of local ordinances no longer tells a Nebraska resident what his legal responsibilities are. One example of such confusion is with the sales reporting requirement in Lincoln's city weapons ordinance. In 936.030, the city has provided that sale of firearms other than sporting rifles or shotguns must be reported to the Department of Public Safety. However, it's the view of the city that this ordinance is preempted for individuals possessing a concealed handgun permit. This limitation on the enforceable scope of the ordinance is not set out in its wording. The only official recognition of the limitation to non-permit holders was made in an August 2010 letter from then Chief of Police Tom Cassidy. I provided a copy to each of you with my written testimony of that letter. Notice of this city policy is not provided to gun dealers who have opened since that date, and the city ordinance in its current form makes no reference to any limitation on the requirement whatsoever. When law-abiding Nebraska residents choose to exercise their constitutional right to keep and bear arms, like other constitutional rights, it is subject to legal restrictions on time, place, and manner. But fairness requires that there be reasonable notice to the regulated public of how to follow the law, and that similar people be treated similarly by the state and by its local subdivisions. Nebraska's Constitution applies to everyone in this state, and this constitutional right should be uniform throughout Nebraska. Thank you for the opportunity to testify. I'd be happy to answer questions.
Any questions? Seeing none, thank you for your book. Senator Murphy.
Thank you. Did you hear my earlier question?
I did.
Just how the federal interstate?
Yeah, so what you're referring to is the Firearm Owners Protection Act, which was passed in May of 1986. Actually, it's the same law that I referenced in my previous testimony. It included the Hughes Amendment that closed the registry to machine guns. But the specific provision you're talking about is the safe passage provision that provides that if your point of origin is a place where it's legal to possess a particular firearm and your destination is a legal destination, as long as you travel with the firearms unloaded, cased, and not accessible to the passenger compartment, then that is an affirmative defense that you can raise against local prosecution under state or local law. Now, again, that's not a great situation to be in where you're having to raise an affirmative defense because that means you've already had a bad day, right? But there is that protection there from the federal government. Unfortunately, we don't have anything similar for folks who are enjoying the other end of our own state.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Thank you for your testimony.
Thank you.
Next proponent.
Good afternoon, Senator Seiler, members of the Judiciary Committee. My name is Marty Bielek, M-A-R-T-Y-B-I-L-E-K. Today I'm representing Mayor Stothert, Mayor of Omaha. The City of Omaha's gun registration ordinance has been in effect for at least 30 years. Then, in 1991, the state legislature passed the Firearms Certification Act, which required Nebraska residents to obtain certification before they would be able to legally acquire a handgun anywhere in the state of Nebraska. 15 years later, in 2006, the legislature passed the Carry Conceal Act, which also allows residents to carry firearms concealed, but only after extensive training. The sequence of compliance is as follows. A prospective first-time gun owner would first need to become firearms certified, which includes a background check. If they lived in Omaha, they would be required to register their handgun, which again requires a background check. And if they would like to carry their firearm concealed, they would obtain a carry concealed permit, which begins yet another criminal history review. Over the last 30 years, laws in the state of Nebraska and the municipalities within have made gun ownership unnecessarily cumbersome to the point where constraints have been placed on the Second Amendment that many consider unconstitutional. In 2013, about 60 people were charged with a gun registration violation in Omaha, and over half of those were dropped by the prosecutor. Usually, if someone has committed a gun violation, other more serious crimes are in play. For example, use of a weapon to commit a felony or possession of a firearm by a felon. Gun registration can be beneficial in tracing guns used in crimes. However, the Federal Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms also performs this service. Finally, the Mayor's Office is currently considering an alternative to our gun registration requirement, a voluntary online registration process that might be expanded to include residents outside the city limits of Omaha. Mayor Stothert would encourage the Judiciary Committee to vote LB 289 out of committee and ultimately pass this legislation.
Marty, I have a question.
Yes, Senator.
Mayor Stoffert's letter, she refers to gun. Is that handgun or is that all guns? Like shotguns, rifles for
But basically,
hunting?
we'll be talking about handguns here because
Handguns.
usually, including the state laws, it just
She
makes
didn't
a
make that
distinction.
clear, so
Okay.
that's why I asked.
Okay.
She just used the term guns. Okay. Any other questions? Seeing none, thank you for your appearance. Further proponent.
Thank you, Senator. My name is David Black. I'm the mayor of the city of Papillion, D-A-V-I-D-B-L-A-C-K. I'm also a member of the Nebraska Firearms and Owners Association. And I think the conversation on the interstate transfer is where this really becomes a practical issue, and you realize how large this state is. And we had some conversation of rural versus urban. But just two examples I want to talk about. My children went to college. Obviously live in Papillion, and my children went to college in Chadron. Papillion to Chadron is further than Papillion to St. Louis. And this is a large state. So if I choose, which I did many times over 7 years, to go to Chadron up through Highway 275, I clip the city of Omaha for about 2 minutes on that travel. I don't know how many jurisdictions I cross that way. If I took the time to research every jurisdiction I went through, I could figure out if I was legal or not. And even if I did that research and I'm in Chadron, and then there's a blizzard, which I've hit twice, so I decide to drop south through Sydney and hit the interstate, and then come through the city of Lincoln for a few minutes. I didn't research all those jurisdictions on the way back because I didn't anticipate the blizzard, and I had a hint of what Lincoln might have been in. In that travel, the idea of I started legal, I was legal most of the time. There might have been a few minutes I was illegal, but I don't have a clue because I haven't gone back to research that. I think that the issue of the intrastate travel is a very big issue. But even bringing it local to the metro area, I'm in Papillion. Most Papillion residents, I don't think, could tell you exact jurisdiction lines between Papillion and La Vista because they're not straight lines. And if I travel up the interstate from La Vista to some of the other areas, going to Cabela's, I might have clipped Omaha for just a few minutes, but I don't know. It's the practicality of the issue that the federal have addressed with interstate transfer, is why I generally agree in this case that it is a constitutional issue in this, and the city should not be able to be stricter than the state. I'm definitely a local rights issue guy. And I'll be here many times testifying that we should have local rights, but in this case, it's a state issue.
Senator.
So you're the best proponent to ask the opponent question. Talk to me about local control. I mean, this is, from my perspective, the state telling the local what to do. And in your case, as the mayor, you obviously agree with this piece of legislation. How do I respond to the mayor who doesn't agree with this piece of legislation?
Tell them to call me.
Okay. There we go.
No, that's a great question. And you know, Nebraska is an interesting state. People believe local control exists in Nebraska. Nebraska is only one of 2 states in the entire nation that local control doesn't even exist because of Dillon's law. 48 states in the United States, a city can do anything it wants to do unless the state tells them they can't. Nebraska, I can't do anything unless the state's given me permission. So local control doesn't exist in Nebraska.
I wish I could just record that and play
Now,
it over and over.
With that being said, I fight all the time to give me permission to let me do what I want to do so we have the perception of local control. This is very unique, though, that we're talking a constitutional issue. And I think that's one of the things that makes it a little bit different. There are almost every other issue we talk about. I don't know if you can point to that it's a constitutional issue, and this is a constitutional issue. I think that's critically different.
Thanks, Mayor.
You're welcome.
Any further questions?
Thank you.
Thank you, Mayor. Next proponent.
Thank you very much. My name is Anna Kopperud, ANNAKOPPERUD, and I'm the Nebraska State Liaison for the National Rifle Association. The NRA supports LB 289, introduced by Senator Ebke. In general, as we all know, this bill would ensure that firearm and ammunition laws are consistent throughout the state. The confusing patchwork of local firearm laws in Nebraska, as it is now, makes compliance very difficult and nearly impossible for responsible gun owners. This creates a situation where gun owners have difficulty even knowing about certain laws from one town to the next, much less understanding them as they travel throughout their own state. Firearm prevention helps create a uniform system of rights and responsibilities for citizens. And interestingly, Nebraska is one of the very few states in the nation without statewide general firearm preemption. I pulled some data on that. There are 45 states that have preemption in the United States, and 4 additional states provide that through judicial ruling, and those 4, Connecticut, Massachusetts, New Jersey, and New York. And within that context, that brings us to 49. The only state with no preemption is Hawaii, and the most recent state to climb on board was Illinois, and they adopted preemption when they were now allowed to conceal carry in their state. Nebraska's interesting. We have a carve-out. It protects handguns only. So there's Hawaii with nothing, Nebraska only with handguns, and there might be one other state that has a small caveat. But I did think that was very relevant to this discussion. The bill as written is straightforward and solid. It still allows municipalities to regulate the discharge of firearms through ordinances as well as zoning considerations. And we've heard in other states people ask about that, and it's well written here, and it's definitely solid. As for the enforcement provisions and damages against the municipalities that fail to follow the law, quite frankly, what's the point of the law if it cannot be enforced against those continuing to blatantly ignore it? Pennsylvania is a good and recent example of what happens when you don't have strong preemption. Over 50 municipalities in Pennsylvania had different laws regarding firearms, and of course that makes it impossible for gun owners to know the law while driving from one small town to the next. Pennsylvania had firearm preemption in place, but without the enforcement and standing clauses, there were larger cities like Pittsburgh, Philadelphia, and Harrisburg that blatantly ignored it, causing a lot of confusion and trouble for its citizens. And that's been addressed in this last legislative section. They added a bit of teeth to that, and things changed very quickly in Pennsylvania. Lastly, I always like to say, please think about beloved Uncle Bob. If he had otherwise known that he was breaking the law, he would have changed his behavior in order to not do that, and he would have been law-abiding. It's our request that you please help ensure that firearm and ammunition laws are consistent throughout the state, and we request your support for this legislation. Thank you.
Any questions? Seeing none, thank you for your testimony.
Very much.
Further in support? Proponents? Opponents?
I am an opponent.
You're an opponent or proponent?
Well, I'm glad to see there's that interest. My name is Amanda Gailey, Gailey, and I'm here on behalf of Nebraskans Against Gun Violence. Preemption laws are how powerful industries that are harmful to public health cripple communities' efforts to protect their citizens. In the 1980s, Big Tobacco pushed preemption to make it nearly impossible for many communities to enact their own smoking ordinances. Pesticide companies have lobbied state governments to preempt local efforts to reduce harmful chemicals. Today, the fossil fuel industry is working to preempt local laws that favor renewable power. And for many years now, the gun lobby has eroded community efforts to reduce gun violence by preempting the ability of towns and cities to regulate guns. Preemption kneecaps grassroots efforts to minimize such obvious community hazards as carcinogens, pollution, and firearms. If the interests of the people were guiding LB 289, we would be here today talking about strengthening gun regulations, not dismantling them. But we are not here to protect the interests of the public. We are here to assist the gun industry and to ease the lives of gun extremists. This preemption bill is a familiar gun industry tactic meant to ensure a fertile market for firearms. It puts the convenience of the gun dependent above every other concern of governance. In Pennsylvania, the NRA is using preemption laws to sue municipal governments for daring to try to curb gun violence. In Florida, preemption laws allow gun extremists to terrorize neighborhoods by setting up shooting ranges in populated areas. And in Nebraska, preemption laws would do away with ordinances that keep guns out of domestic violence shelters in Lincoln, and that require someone open carrying a loaded gun in Omaha to have undergone all of 8 hours of training. A preemption law in Nebraska would allow people convicted of stalking, impersonating a police officer, or unlawful possession of explosives to possess guns in Lincoln. It would void the Lincoln law against leaving a gun indefinitely attended in a car. Preemption asks us to care less about the public good than we do about simplifying things for the people who endanger us with guns in public. It is a credit to our state that we have not enacted firearm preemption laws. We can see that they have had regrettable consequences in other states that have been hoodwinked by the gun lobby, and they are difficult to remove once in place. This bill gives our legislature an opportunity to tell an arm-twisting, deadly industry that Nebraska puts its people first. Thank you.
Any further questions? Thank you very much. Next opponent. We'll get you next, ma'am.
My name is Courtney Lawton, Courtney Lawton. Senators and Honorable Chair, LB 289 and preemption might seem like a good idea, and I, who am opposed to LB 289, would like to propose a way to make it truly a great idea. Let's scrap Senator Ebke's gun lobby crafted bill and create a state firearm law at least as restrictive as the aggregated gun ordinances for all of the municipalities in Nebraska. The ideal preemption law should prohibit statewide the open carry of firearms without a concealed carry license, as in Nebraska. It should continue to prohibit the discharge of firearms in the city except for police, as in North Platte, Kearney, and Crete. It should prohibit guns in parks, cemeteries, and municipal buildings, as in Chadron and Alliance, and prohibit people from shooting animals within city limits, as in McCook. The ideal preemption law should do what current state law and municipal ordinances actually fail to do today, which is prohibit the carry of weapons into airports. The ideal preemption law should be at least as restrictive as possible, because any preemption law would remove city and county agility to address local violence and gun proliferation. Different cities have different needs. Should we strip local governing bodies' power of regulation? Should we give that power to the state of Nebraska? Then the unicameral should strive to meet as many needs as possible by writing the most restrictive law possible based on existing local ordinances. But that is not what Senator Ebke's preemption law does. This is a law crafted by the gun lobby to line the pockets of the NRA and gun dealers. Thanks to preemption laws, Phoenix, Arizona is actually powerless to prevent armed people from entering Sky Harbor Airport. Thanks to preemption, the NRA is suing Pennsylvania's municipalities with mandatory gun theft reporting laws. Senator Ebke's LB 289 contains language in Section 5 that encourages these exact same lawsuits. Should David City or Scotts Bluff attempt to prohibit guns in parks or libraries, any group of people, including the NRA or any out-of-state organization, can effectively sue and bankrupt those city councils, small and large, for purported violations of the preemption laws. LB 289 effectively deprives local voters of their voices and municipalities of their authority when they seek to regulate the proliferation of deadly weapons in their communities. Is this how the unicameral envisions using the precious tax dollars of Nebraska farmers and families? Budget busting, small cities, towns defending themselves against out-of-state mercenary lawyers of the NRA? Our small towns and cities cannot afford this bill, senators. I implore you to consider the unintended consequences of this bill: legislative confusion, court costs, frivolous lawsuits, and proliferation of weapons in our peaceable communities. I'm open to any questions.
Anybody have any questions? Seeing none, thank you for your testimony.
Thank you so much.
I believe this lady's been up about 3 times over here.
Thank you.
Members of the Judiciary Committee, thank you for allowing me to testify today about this important issue. My name is Jan Hobbs. For the record, that's Jan, B as in boy, B as in boy, S as in Sam. I am the mother of 2 children. I served honorably in the United States Air Force, and I am a volunteer with the Nebraska chapter of Moms Demand Action for Gun Sense in America. Moms Demand Action is a grassroots movement of American moms and dads fighting for public safety measures that respect the Second Amendment while protecting Americans from gun violence. Moms Demand Action is part of Everytown for Gun Safety, the largest gun violence prevention organization in the country, with more than 2.5 million members. I am here today representing thousands of Nebraska moms who oppose Bill LB 289, the preemption bill. This bill would block our towns and cities from passing firearm-related public safety laws, robbing local governments of the ability to adopt common-sense gun laws that fit local conditions. State gun laws should not be one-size-fits-all. Cities with different public safety needs should have the power to write laws that we need to keep us safe. LB 289 would prevent those most familiar with local criminal activity, our police chiefs and our mayors, from taking common sense measures to keep their communities safe. It would allow out-of-state gun lobby organizations to sue our cities and towns and collect outrageous fees from the taxpayers. Local law enforcement and government officials know best how to keep their communities safe, and they are the ones who should determine local public safety policies, not state legislators, and certainly not the gun lobby. On behalf of the Nebraska chapter of Moms Demand Action, I urge you to vote no on LB 289, and I'd like to thank you again for your time.
Any questions? Thank you for your testimony. Next opponent.
Senators and Honorable Chair, my name is Danielle Savington, D-A-N-I-E-L-L-E-S-A-V-I-N-G-T-O-N. At my house, spring is a code for soccer season. So in preparation last weekend, I went to the store and I got my daughter, who's a goalkeeper, some new gloves. I got my son some new soccer cleats because his toes were bursting out of the toes of his. I took him home and my son was so excited about his super awesome new shoes until he looked at his sister's gloves. Then he starts to grumble, "Why didn't I get any gloves? That's not fair." I wanted to laugh, but I couldn't because he was serious. Because he's a kid and he doesn't understand. Fair doesn't always mean identical. The Nebraska Commission on Law Enforcement and Criminal Justice released Crime in Nebraska 2013. In the report, we can see that in Nebraska communities with 500,000 residents or greater, there were over 3,080 auto thefts in the year 2013. In Nebraska communities with fewer than 5,000 residents, there was a cumulative 39 cars stolen. In Lincoln, where leaving a gun unattended indefinitely in a car is against the code, there were over 300 cars stolen. So if we figure only a few of those cars maybe could have guns left in them unattended once preemption takes effect and the ability for Lincoln to have this Lincoln-specific law in place, we would have an uptick in stolen, unauthorized firearms inside of Lincoln. Firearms now in the hands of criminals bold enough to steal a gun, who knows how much bolder now that they have a stolen firearm. In Deschler, Nebraska, there were 0 cars stolen in 2013. It just doesn't make sense for Deschler, Nebraska to have a rule saying that you can't leave your firearm unattended in your car. Deschler, Nebraska, it's a farming community. It's a ranching community. It makes sense for farmers and ranchers to leave their guns in their vehicles. In Lincoln, not so much. So what do? Do we preempt Lincoln's municipal codes and allow residents to leave their guns in their cars, even though we know that there's a greater likelihood that the car will be stolen and the firearm subsequently lost to the rightful owner? Or do we force Nebraska's rural communities, its safer communities, to adapt to the way things are done in the much larger cities? Senators, we're adults. We understand that goalkeepers need new gloves and boys need new cleats. We understand that Deschler and Lincoln are 2 different places. We can understand that fair doesn't always mean getting the exact same thing. Fair means we each get what we need in order to be successful. The diversity of Nebraska's urban, suburban, and rural communities relies on our ability to recognize preemption legislation for its childlike demand that everybody gets exactly the same thing. I urge you to vote no on LB 289 because being fair in Nebraska means recognizing that our cities and municipalities know what is best for their citizens and they know what makes sense in their own areas of the state. Thank you. I'm happy to answer any questions.
Any questions? Seeing none, thank you for your testimony. Next opponent.
Good afternoon. My name is Melody Vaccaro, M-E-L-O-D-Y, V-A-C-C-A-R-O, and I oppose LB 289. LB 289 asks us to take the lowest standard of firearms laws and apply them to every municipality in Nebraska. I've submitted a report to the committee with a list of people who have been shot this year,
2015 in Nebraska, along with the city or village where the shooting happened. At least 37 people have been shot so far, and 22 of them were in the city of Omaha. LB 289 would force Omaha, the Nebraska city with the most gun violence, to refer to state law and allow untrained people to openly carry firearms throughout their city. And it would nullify other ordinances they've enacted to curb gun violence. In a city that already leads Nebraska in gun violence, that's a really bad idea. Thank you.
Any questions? Thank you very much for your testimony. Any further opponents? People speaking against the bill? Anybody else? Anybody in the neutral? Anybody in the neutral? Seeing none, I'll close the record. The documents submitted will be made part of the record. And Senator Epke, you may close.
Thank you, Chairman Seiler. I will make this quick. First of all, I would just note that I know Deschler quite well. It's in my district, and I would never say that it's a ranching community. They do a lot of farming there, though. I dare say that those who would say that we should ignore our state constitution, which is essentially what many are saying here, would have never argued that the states should be allowed to ignore the First Amendment, or that the states should be allowed to ignore the 14th Amendment, and yet they would have us explicitly allow communities to ignore the citizen-passed Article 1 of the Nebraska Constitution. Again, this does not affect discharge ordinances that communities already have, but it does allow those who are possessing weapons legally and lawfully to go ahead and continue doing so without fear of running afoul of transport and possession issues. I understand the concerns about gun violence, but I also understand that we have a Constitution. And if we want to amend that Constitution, I would encourage those who believe that that's an appropriate thing to do to start down that path. Thank you.
Any questions? Seeing none, thank you for your testimony. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for providing yourself here. This is part of our unicameral system. Thank you very much.